You might have thought that obedience to God should immediately bring peace and emotional clarity. But what if the silence you're feeling is not distance at all, but something far deeper and more unsettling than you assumed? In the next few minutes, I'll show you why this season doesn't mean abandonment and what it is actually shaping inside you. You sit in the same place you always pray, maybe early in the morning or late at night when everything is quiet around you. You open your Bible like you used to, you try to focus, you try to connect, but something feels different this time. The words are there, the habit is there, but the sense of presence feels distant in a way you cannot explain. And inside, there is a quiet conflict you don't easily say out loud. You are still trying to do the right things, still trying to stay faithful, but emotionally, it feels like something has gone silent in you. Part of you wonders if this is growth, but another part quietly fears it might be disconnection. What I want you to see is that this silence is not as simple as spiritual failure or emotional distance. There is something deeper happening beneath what you feel, and it is not what most people assume in this season. By the end of this, you will begin to recognize what this silence is actually doing in your life. If this resonates with you, let me know in the comments. Because for many believers, the hardest part is not the silence itself, but the story they start telling themselves about it. There is a painful paradox that very few are willing to face. Immediately after you decide to walk away from your mistakes and turn back to look for a spiritual anchor, what you expect most is a sense of relief. You wait for an embrace, an immediate divine response. But in reality, the very first thing that welcomes you is an absolute silence. You open the sacred book, but only read out of obligation. The words sit there, cold and lifeless on the page. You stand in the middle of a service. The music is playing, but your mind is completely blank. You kneel down, pouring out your bitterest prayers, and yet when you open your eyes, you are still surrounded by nothing but four quiet walls. Not a single sound. It is at this exact moment that a deep unease begins to consume you. The silence itself is terrifying, but what is 100 times more dangerous is how we interpret that silence. The silence is not what breaks most believers. The interpretation of it does. Modern people constantly rely on immediate feedback to reassure themselves. We need to feel warmth to believe we are loved. We need to feel emotional moving to believe that a divine power is present. So when those emotions suddenly vanish, our minds instantly plunge into panic. Silence manufactures self-accusation faster than any physical suffering. You begin to draw your own conclusions. Maybe you have gone too far. Perhaps the wounds and failures of your past have created an unbridgeable gulf. Maybe he has finally stepped away, and that thought changes everything. You become trapped in the mindset that this silence is a punishment or proof of your own failure. The emptiness in the room now transforms into an invisible verdict, whispering that you are no longer accepted. You feel that all your efforts are completely worthless. Nothing moves. But are we confusing our temporary feelings with his reality? But what if numbness and spiritual death are not the same thing? To understand why your soul has grown so numb, we must look directly at a modern reality. People today are rarely ever in true silence. We are constantly swimming in an endless stream of stimulation. It comes from mindless scrolling, urban noise, notifications popping up every second, and the non-stop pressure to remain productive. Your nervous system is constantly forced into a state of hyper-alertness. We sleep with our phones right next to our beds. We try to pray, yet our fingers itch to check notifications. Many of us cannot endure a silence that lasts more than a few minutes. We forgot how to be still. This is why, when you finally step into a quiet space before him, the silence suddenly feels unfamiliar. The peace now carries a strange sense of emptiness. Some people are not far from God. They are just overstimulated. When a nervous system is exhausted from constant overstimulation, it begins to misinterpret stillness as a threat. Peace now feels unnatural to them. You enter the silence and mistake it for his absence. But the truth is not that he has abandoned you. The truth is that your body and mind have lost the capacity to process stillness. Overstimulated people often mistake peace for emptiness. The story of the prophet Elijah is a perfect mirror for this generation. He was not in the great and powerful wind, nor in the earthquake, nor in the raging fire. He only appeared in a gentle, low whisper. But how can we hear a whisper when our minds are like a loud factory roaring with anxiety? The spiritual numbness you are enduring is actually a cry for help from a body worn out by the digital age. There is an invisible thread connecting a numb soul to an exhausted nervous system. But exhaustion is only part of the story. At this stage, we must confront a deeper and more challenging truth. There is a generation of believers who have successfully walked away from obvious sins. They are no longer addicted to worldly vices. But unintentionally, they have fallen into a different kind of addiction, an addiction to spiritual highs. They constantly seek out high-intensity experiences, emotional worship sessions, and the desperate need to always feel on fire. And so, when those waves of intense emotion inevitably recede, they instantly panic and assume that the divine has disappeared. They only feel close to him when standing in massive conferences or high-energy faith camps. But the moment the event ends, they face an immediate spiritual crash. They require an emotional atmosphere just to feel connected. Emotion is a gift, but dependence on emotion is a trap. Some believers do not miss God. They miss the feeling. The reality is, a mature relationship cannot survive on adrenaline alone. Emotional intensity is not always intimacy, and tears are not always transformation. Not every emotional moment creates deep roots. This is why our spiritual foundations easily shake. Feelings are unstable foundations. This brings to mind the story of the Apostle Thomas. He refused to believe unless he could physically see, unless he could literally touch the nail scars of his teacher. He required tangible proof for his senses in exchange for peace of mind. But are we walking by faith? Or are we actually just walking by sensory experiences? Are we confusing a divine presence with psychological stimulation? The silence you are experiencing, ironically, is not abandonment. It is an intentional detox from emotional stimulation, forcing you to connect with him through your truest self, rather than through a nervous system craving excitement. That changes the whole conversation. And this is where many believers misunderstand maturity. Let us stop for a moment and look directly at the root of your inner struggle right now. Maybe you did not lose the divine presence as you think. Maybe you just lost the emotional stimulation that you confused with his presence. This single misunderstanding is quietly shaping your entire spiritual journey. Silence is not an end, but an invitation. An invitation to step out of the comfort zone of shallow emotions and move into the depth of true maturity. But that opens up a much bigger question. If emotional highs are no longer the metric to prove a divine connection, then what does a mature faith actually look like? When you move past the illusions of emotion, you begin to understand a brand new perspective on growth. A truly mature faith never means your soul is always on fire or filled with intense feelings. In fact, it is quite the opposite. As you grow, your emotional crutches may be intentionally removed. This is not a sign of rejection, but a transition to guide you toward a committed and stable love. Think of a real-life marriage. The explosive emotions of the honeymoon phase fade very quickly, but the covenant consistency and loyalty are what remain to define true love. Mature love is always much quieter and more stable than temporary excitement. Consistency is harder than intensity. A stable faith often feels quieter than an immature one. Therefore, obedience without any emotional reward is actually the pinnacle of spiritual intimacy. It is when you maintain the habit of prayer, even when you find no emotional surge. You still open the sacred pages to read, even when no words move you immediately. You still choose to live rightly and love others during the most ordinary days of your life. This journey is like how a fruit-bearing tree is described in ancient texts. Fruit does not grow overnight through dramatic thunder and lightning, but it grows quietly and slowly through steady days of sun and rain. Maturity does not make you louder or more dramatic, but it makes you more rooted and less reactive to your circumstances. But do we have enough patience to let our roots be nourished in the silence of the earth? You keep walking, not because you feel motivated, but because you know what is true. That is growth. And the cross is the reason this silence cannot destroy you. In the end, we must bring our minds back to the most solid anchor. The nature of emotions is that they constantly change, like clouds gathering and fading across the sky. But a sacred covenant does not. There are mornings when you wake up and feel your soul is completely numb. But that numbness has no authority to rewrite the reality that you still belong to Him. A bad emotional day can never shake a covenant that has already been established. Your emotions are unstable witnesses. We no longer have to live under the fear of abandonment. On Calvary, Christ fully stepped into isolation and bore the absolute silence of separation once and for all. Because He experienced total abandonment, the silence you face today is no longer a punishment. Silence has no right to redefine your identity. The verdict was settled before today's emotions existed. Nothing changed overnight. True faith is built on what is finished, not on what we feel. The absence of emotion does not prove the absence of the Creator. When you look at the cross, you find the ultimate answer to every silence in life. You are accepted, not because you feel it, but because a price has been fully paid. So how do you walk through a season where emotions cannot lead you anymore? When the mists of emotion fade away, what remains behind is the ultimate and most beautiful test of a spiritual life. Mature believers continue to walk, continue to obey, and continue to show up even when all emotional rewards disappear. The modern world constantly celebrates moments of dramatic emotional intensity, but it fails to understand that the most sacred things are forged in the quietness of endurance. The deepest faith is often the least dramatic. This is not a fake faith or a forced effort. This is a faith that has grown its roots deep into the ground. The silence of the past seasons did not destroy them. Instead, it refined them into unshakable souls. When you choose to pray without needing an immediate emotional payoff, when you choose to live rightly during the most ordinary days, that consistency becomes your greatest testimony. Quiet obedience always carries a great power. Ancient texts remind us of those who ran the race and kept the faith, not because they constantly saw miracles, but because they knew the one who promised was faithful. They did not live by the feelings of today. They lived by the eternal reality of tomorrow. The silence completed its work. You stayed. You kept praying. You kept showing up. That is not weakness. That is an undefeated strength. The silence you experience after obedience is not a sign of spiritual abandonment, but often a deeper transition where emotional dependence is being replaced with a stable faith that is no longer led by feelings. If you've made it this far, you're someone who is learning to stay faithful even when emotions are no longer carrying you. Let's keep growing in a faith that remains steady even in silence, one step at a time. If this message speaks to where you are right now, I'd really like to hear how it's shaping your perspective in the comments below. And if you want to continue building a deeper and more grounded walk in faith, you can join this community and grow with us. You are not forgotten, and this season is not the end of your story.